Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to get the Comanche up and running. Last week we got the body painted and put together and had a very quick look in the box with the chassis. We've got a set of Austar swampers on some plastic bead locks. Now they're nothing too special, but they are quite big and they should look nice and chunky filling the large arches on the body. There's the chassis, which we'll have a better look at in a minute. It's got a 313mm wheelbase and is a mix of SCX 10, 1 and 2. There's also a bag with all the other bits and pieces that it comes with. Not too surprisingly, the dampers on the chassis aren't the greatest, as evident by all the oil that's soaked into the cardboard. It's pretty common, even on a lot of more expensive kits the dampers end up leaking. But then on a slow moving scale truck it's not really much of a problem. Okay, with it unpacked we can have a look through the little accessory pack. In the clear bag we've got a plastic servo mount. It puts the steering servo across the chassis right at the front. It looks very similar to the metal aftermarket mounts for the SCX 10 too, so I'm sure it's going to be pretty easy to upgrade it later. In the bubble wrap we've got the front bumper. It looks nice enough, but it is plastic. It's flexible, so it should put up with a good few bumps, and like the servo mount, I'm sure I've come across metal bumpers that do look very similar. We've got a packet with some shackle mounts. Now they're plastic too, so they're not really going to be of much use. There's no shackles though, so if we get a set of the usual cheap ones, they're going to come with metal base plates anyway. In this one we've got the drive pins, wheel hexes and wheel nuts, and they all look perfectly serviceable. This packet has a set of hubcaps and screws, and with them fitted they'll nicely hide the M4 nut with something that looks a bit more scale. Nice to have, but I don't think we're going to use them. If and when the wheel nuts need to be tightened or removed, to get a hub off is a huge faff having to remove all those small screws. The last packet has the post for mounting the bumper. They're aluminium, which should make the bumper mounting nice and solid. It's a little surprising that they didn't try and mould them straight into the bumper though, or make a plastic mount with the posts. So that lot is what you get for about 90 quid. If you search eBay for Austar 313mm chassis, there's quite a few sellers at the time of this video. The price and availability are going to change. For right now though, it's a pretty good deal. If you're going to end up using different tyres, you can always get the chassis only kit instead. The steering servo mount also has a set of 4 M3 screws in a bag. The quality of them looks good enough, at the upper end of the cheap fixing spectrum I think. Now the mount will kind of fit either way up, but the side bits are shaped so it fits the curve of the chassis. When it's upside down, the angle of the bumper mount points down. If we flip it over, the mount slides in nicely and everything lines up. On the side there's 4 holes that match the holes in the chassis, and it just so happens that they've given us 4 screws, so that's where we're going to fit them. The plastic parts feel fairly tough, but they are quite light. So I'm thinking they would strip fairly easily if you went crazy with the torque. The front bumper mounting posts just slide into the holes in the front of the servo mount. They're held in with the provided M2.5 screws and nuts, but first we'll need to attach them to the bumper itself. We'll use a little bit of thread lock in the holes in the end of the bumper mounts and give it a stir with a cocktail stick before wiping off any excess. We want the thread lock in the threads but not all over the face. Threadlock has a nasty habit of attacking plastic, making it brittle, which for a bumper really wouldn't be ideal. Now we just hold them up to the bumper and install the 2 M3 screws. The holes in the bumper are slotted to take into account any misalignment, so do them up lightly until the bumper's slid into the servo mount, then torque them up properly. Now, since the 2 small screws that fix the mounts of the bumper come with plain nuts, we would usually want to add a little bit of thread lock just to make sure they don't drop out. However, I just so happen to have some M2.5 nylocks going spare, so I'm going to use them instead of the plain nuts. It'll make it that bit cleaner to swap out if and when we change the bumper. Getting the wheels on is absolutely standard stuff, other than clipping the zip tie that goes through the hole in the stub axle. All we need to do is pop one of the pins in, slide a hex over the top, which by the way is a nice snug fit, so it's not going to drop off the first time you remove the wheel, which is always nice. Then we pop the wheel on, followed by one of the wheel nuts. Repeat that a few more times and we've got a rolling chassis. So as a quick tour, we've got a hybrid SCX 10, SCX 10 2 and some plastic versions of aftermarket bits. Now it all feels quite solid, if a bit light, The plastics definitely aren't going to be Traxxas tough, but they should be good enough. And of course, there's always lots of SCX10 hop-ups that are going to fit, so stronger parts shouldn't be that difficult to find. The transmission does sound a little bit rough when we push the truck. Now I'm going to assume that they have put some grease in. It feels like there is, but it's just not very well distributed. The gear train and the drive shafts will most likely free up after a few minutes of cruising around. As for the steering, it's very definitely from the SCX-10-2 with its rather impressive lock. All the drivetrain joints are CV rather than UJ, so with any luck they'll put up with the angles. They do look a lot like those really cheap ones you see all over eBay though, but we'll see. As long as the pins don't drop out, they should last for a little while at least. If we pop the Comanche body on and centre it up, we can see it fits pretty much perfectly. We'll need to lift the front up a little bit to get it level, but the wheelbase is as close to spot on as it ever gets. Now, my plan was to simply make some body mounts that fit the standard body mount holes in the damper mounts, but that would have raised the rear up by a good 5mm, and the front damper mount was actually a rear one bodged in place which made it lean back. Now, I looked at it for a couple of days on and off trying to think of a nice way to do it, and well, I gave up and designed a whole new set of damper mounts with the body mounts built in. The body's held on with a load of 8mm neodymium magnets, which should be more than strong enough. It's a bit of a struggle to get the body off. Under the body there's some mating mounts that are glued on with some epoxy, and the front mount has a spacer to get the height right. At the rear then we've got this funky looking bit. Now the rear bit is largely the same shape as the stock mount, except it doesn't have the bit for the body posts, allowing for the thickness of the bit that's glued inside the body. The extension at the front leans the damper over a bit, which in effect makes the suspension softer, adds a bit more travel at the expense of making them a bit less linear. With the rear of the truck being that much lighter than the front, it should even things out. At the front of the chassis, the new damper mounts make the dampers pretty much straight. Even then, I ended up having to adjust the preload spacers around 5mm to get the chassis level with the body and battery on. That just leaves the rock sliders. Now the stock ones were quite flat, so with the body on there was a good 10mm gap which didn't really look good at all. They mount to the same holes at the stock parts, but because I've used the inside faces as the bottom surface on the printer, it doesn't quite match up with the bends on the chassis. I think I'm going to need to make some wedge-shaped spacers to take up the gaps before the truck gets a serious run. And there's one more new part. I added a cross member between the rock sliders, partly to try and add a bit more reinforcement, but also because the stock part that goes between the rails gets in the way of the upper suspension links. Now it's a bit dark, but the bit goes between the chassis rails and has two posts on the top for the battery tray. With the weight of the body, the upper links were resting on it, binding up the front suspension when there was still a good 1/3 of the travel left. If you have a quick look at the bits in SketchUp, it should be a bit clearer. The cross member goes across with the bit that matches up with the battery tray. There's enough clearance that with the repositioned front dampers, the suspension can use all the damper travel without any issue. The damper and body mount should already be pretty clear as to what they do, but we'll have a quick look at them in the SketchUp file. I think the only odd bit that caught me out were the holes for mounting the rear mounts are oddly spaced. I started off with them evenly spaced, assuming they were all the same, but it was a bit of a surprise when they weren't even close to fitting. With X-ray mode on, you can see all the holes for the magnets and the screw holes. It'll be interesting to see how robust it all is. Hopefully it's going to last a good while. To get the chassis running, we're going to need to add a few more bits. First we've got yet another 20kg servo. Now, it doesn't really matter which one you get. I've tried most of the cheap 20kg servos now, and they all seem to be near enough the same. For the servo arm, we'll use one of these cheap aluminium ones. To match the servo, this one is a 25 spline. For the radio, we're going to use a basic 3-channel fly sky, but if you want to go mad with the lights at some point, it's going to be very easy to swap it for 6 or 8 channels. For now, we're going to use an X-Car 45A for the ESC. You can get them for well under 10 quid, and by default they're set up in crawler mode with instant forward and reverse with a drag brake. It's a nice little ESC. The only real issue is the drag brake is a bit all or nothing, which can cause issues on a steep descent. This one's been in quite a few trucks now. It's the one that goes in most of the trucks before splashing out on a WP 1080. The servo just drops in from the top and gets attached with 4 screws. Now unfortunately the screws aren't included, but if you've built a few kits you're going to have something laying around that will work. Some M3x8s will do, but I'm going to use a set of Tamiya self-tappers. They're just going into plastic, so they're going to do the trick. From the underside we need to install the servo arm. I'm going to use a servo tester to centre up the servo so we can fit the arm at the right angle. As I've mentioned before, I'd love to sell more of these things, but the particular LCDs I'm using are a pain to find. The market's been flooded with similar, but just slightly incompatible ones. Anyway, with that connected up and set to servo centre, we can pop the arm on. We want it to be facing straight out the front, parallel with the chassis rails. It looks like it's going to get very close to the servo mount, so hopefully it's going to clear. To attach it, you need to find a short machine screw in the servo accessory bag. Now it's fairly important to use the one that comes with the servo, as sometimes they're going to be M2.5 rather than M3, which might catch you out. As it's all metal, we're going to use a tiny bit of thread lock on the screw. We really don't need much. Nip up the screw, and in the case of this particular type of arm, there's also 2 more tiny screws that clamp the arm to the spline that are going to need a little bit of thread lock and a tighten too. Now we can test the servo end to end to see if it's clearing okay. And I can't hear any scraping, so I think we're good to go. If nothing else, it means that the servo is mounted up as high and out of the way as possible, which is very good. I lost a bit of footage here, probably because I forgot to hit the record button. It does happen every so often, but what I've done is I've attached a steering rod to the outer hole on the servo arm with an M3 screw and a bit of thread lock. Now I had to adjust the end of the rod just a little bit, as it was just a touch short to get the steering straight. When choosing a screw, make sure that it doesn't stick out the bottom and rub on the servo mount. It would be very easy to miss and could cause some damage. So the setup seems pretty good, but there's an awful lot of play. Now surprisingly it's not in the hubs, rather it's the stub axle wobbling about. It's most likely the bearings that aren't really up to scratch, but that's probably the most common issue with these cheap RCs anyway. We'll see how they get on when we're running, but I think we're going to be swapping them out pretty soon. The rest of the assembly is quite typical, plugging in the servo, ESC and all that fun stuff, so for now we'll just skip most of that. When we change it out for a WP1080 and work out how to waterproof the receiver, we're going to have a closer look. The current install is really just temporary. I've stuck all the bits down with some servo tape and run the antenna along the edge of a rock slider. Not ideal, but it should give us more than enough range for a scale truck. We can pop the body back on now and see how it all fits. And there it is. It could do with a chassis mounted rear bumper and maybe a metal front bumper, but other than that it all looks rather good. In terms of suspension travel, I can put this pot of flux under one of the front wheels and still have a little bit left. It's not crazy amounts of articulation, but it's more than a lot of other trucks. I suppose there's one thing left to do before a quick test run. We need to fit the interior. Now it's not much, but I think it will look a bit better than seeing through the windows right to the ground. It's really just a bit of vac form plastic, so it's not going to take much to mount. The front bumper mount spacer does get in the way though, so we're going to need to mark up the front and trim some plastic for clearance. To attach it, we're just going to use a bit of Velcro. It weighs next to nothing, so screws are probably a bit overkill. Plus the Velcro means we don't need to be accurate. We just need to stick some on here and there, and job's done. First though, there is the little decal sheet. There's no guide as to where they're supposed to go, but most of them are pretty obvious. And really it doesn't matter that much, as it's not going to be a perfect replica anyway. The interior has an overspray film, so don't forget to peel that off. I still have one of my first RCs that I very carefully painted and spent ages sticking all the decals to the body, only to notice years later that it still had the overspray film on. Really annoying, but I'd like to think most people have done it at least once. With the decals on, we just need to stick some strips of Velcro, a bit on the front and a bit on the back, pop the interior in, and it's good to go. Now it doesn't look brilliant, but it's definitely better than not having one at all. I suppose painting the seats a brown or a black might help. We might have to do that at some point. Anyway, that's the truck put together, so let's pop outside for a quick, easy-going test run. We're not going to do anything too strenuous, as the rock sliders aren't fully mounted yet. We still need to get those wedge spacers. But we can get a feel for it and see how the transmission smooths out once we've been running it for a while. When the truck's coming straight at the camera, you can see the camber on the front wheels quite clearly. Now that's just the slop in front bearings more than anything. They do seem to be running okay though. So I'm going to leave you to the rest of the video. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you got something to say. Bye guys. Yep, you hit it. That's it. Right, oh, full left and forward.